Hi there, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. This is lesson number 18. We're going to talk about CFR again, cost and freight, but mainly CIF, cost, insurance and freight, named port of destination. But first, the necessary disclaimer. I am not a lawyer, and the contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication, number 723E of the International Chamber of Commerce. My explanations, my comments, and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. In this lesson, we'll examine where CIF differs to CFR, such as in A5 and B5 insurance and A9, B9 allocation of costs. We'll also look at how CFR and CIF both work with letter of credit transactions. And as always, I'll explain what the book says first, which is where the other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop if they get that far, but then I'll examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. A5, insurance. Unless otherwise agreed, or customary in the particular trade, the seller must obtain at its own cost cargo insurance, complying with the cover provided by clauses C of the Institute Cargo Clauses, LMA/IUA, or any similar clauses. The insurance shall be contracted with underwriters or an insurance company of good repute and entitle the buyer or any other person having an insurable interest in the goods to claim directly from the insurer. When required by the buyer, the seller must, subject to the buyer providing any necessary information requested by the seller, provide at the buyer's cost any additional cover, if procurable, such as cover complying with the Institute War Clauses and or Institute Strikes Clauses, LMA/IUA, or any similar clauses, unless such cover is already included with the cargo insurance described in the preceding paragraph. The insurance shall cover at a minimum the price provided in the contract plus 10%, i.e. 110%, and shall be in the currency of the contract. The insurance shall cover the goods from the point of delivery set out in A2 to at least the named port of destination. The seller must provide the buyer with the insurance policy or certificate or any other evidence of insurance cover. Moreover, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost, with information that the buyer needs to procure any additional insurance. Well, so what risks do Institute Cargo Clauses C cover? Well, they are specific risks, unlike Institute Cargo Clauses A, which is effectively an all risk except certain risks. Institute Cargo Clauses C is defined risks. Fire or explosion, vessel or craft being stranded, grounded, sunk or capsized, overturning or derailment of land conveyance, collision or contact of a vessel, craft or conveyance with any external object other than water. Discharge of cargo at a port of distress. General average sacrifice. And jettison. Let's look at the clausing in isolation. The insurance shall cover, at a minimum, the price provided in the contract plus 10%. So why the extra 10%? Well, a legal book going back into the 1800s reported a case in which an additional 3.5% was for loss of imaginary profit. But that was a different era and different import processes entirely to now. So I disagree. Loss of imaginary profit is different to loss or damage of goods, and these days a fixed allowance of 10% is added to include extra costs such as port charges, import clearance, trucking, bank charges, staff costs, etc., to be factored into the ultimate claim value. The seller must provide the buyer with the insurance policy or certificate or any other evidence of insurance cover. A policy is a standalone insurance for one shipment in such circumstances or for multiple shipments during a stated period. A certificate is usually issued under an existing open or annual policy held by the seller to just cover a particular shipment. Most insurance documents will name the seller as the insured or assured and will require endorsement so that whoever has the insurable risk at the time of an event can make a claim under that policy. Now, do be careful about who countersigns the face of the document. If there is provision for a countersignature, it should be the seller, not the insurance company, not the insurance broker, not an insurance agent. B5. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to make a contract of insurance. However, the buyer must provide the seller, upon request, with any information necessary for the seller to procure any additional insurance requested by the buyer under A5. Now, this means that if the buyer wants additional insurance, such as war and strikes clauses or others, which are not already included with the seller's insurance cover, then the buyer is obliged, of course, to provide the seller with necessary information. So now we'll go to the allocation of costs. The seller must pay A. All costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, other than those payable by the buyer under B9. The seller must pay B, the freight and all other costs resulting from A4, including the costs of loading the goods on board and transport-related security costs. The seller must pay C, any charges for unloading at the agreed port of discharge that were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The seller must pay D, the costs of transit that were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. E, the cost of providing the usual proof to the buyer under A6 that the goods have been delivered. The seller must pay F, the costs of insurance resulting from A5. The seller must pay G, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to export clearance under A7A, and the seller must pay the buyer for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with B7A. The seller must pay F, the cost of insurance resulting from A5. What is this? This item is additional to the items in CFR to place the costs of insurance on the seller. B9. Allocation of costs. The buyer must pay all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under A2, other than those payable by the seller under A9. The buyer must pay B. The costs of transit, unless such costs were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The buyer must pay C. Unloading costs, including lighterage and wharfage charges, unless such costs and charges were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The buyer must pay D. The costs of any additional insurance procured at the buyer's request under A5 and B5. The buyer must pay E. The seller for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information in accordance with A5 and A7B. The buyer must pay F, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to transit or import clearance under B7B, and the buyer must pay G, any additional costs incurred if it fails to give notice in accordance with B10 from the agreed date or the end of the agreed period for shipment, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. So we'll examine D, the costs of any additional insurance procured at the buyer's request. This item is additional to the items in CFR to place on the buyer the costs of any additional insurance it requests, such as war and strike risks, if not already included with the seller's insurance cover. So now we'll get to letters of credit. How does an LC function with a CFR CIF transaction? Very well. CFR and CIF are in effect the only Incoterms 2020 rules which actually work hand in hand with LCs. LCs almost invariably specify a port of loading, a port of discharge, a latest date of shipment, and require presentation of an onboard transport document. These are all arranged by and within the control of the seller. As a buyer then, what do I request my bank to state in the LC for CIF? Require presentation of one original insurance certificate or policy endorsed in blank under Institute Cargo Clauses C, Institute War Clauses Cargo and Institute Strikes Clauses Cargo for 110% of the invoice CIF value. There is, in this third decade of the 21st century, no need for showing agent at destination, claims payable in destination country, strikes rights and civil commotions, transshipment risks, warehouse to warehouse, and all the other nonsense that is long outdated and or incorrect, but banks still keep using them. In summary then, these rules, CFR and CIF, are identical except in insurance and allocation of costs. Many people think that delivery under CFR and CIF is when the goods are discharged from the vessel at destination. But no, delivery is when the seller places its goods on board the vessel at the port of loading and the buyer is obliged to take delivery there. The buyer is also obliged to receive them from the carrier at the named port of destination. These two rules work very well with letters of credit. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to any new sessions, please hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Thank you.